Hey everyone, it's Josh. This week, instead of giving our normal introduction, I just wanted to say a few quick words. When we say Life on Side B is a ministry of Posture Shift, that means that Posture Shift picks up the costs of the podcast that are not covered by our patrons. I'm saying this because currently Posture Shift is doing a spring fundraiser right now. If you love this podcast and are able to give, consider going to postureshift.com/give today and support the ministry. It helps Posture Shift continue to make churches safer for queer people and helps continue the work of this podcast. Thanks as well to all of our patrons who continue to give and make this happen. We love you all. We wouldn't be able to do this without you. Now, let's go on to the episode.
All right. Welcome, Life on Side B family. We are here today to talk about some pretty heavy things, which is necessary, especially when we are talking about resiliency. Sometimes you need to talk about the things that put us in a position that require resiliency. And we have an amazing guest with us. Our dear friend Lesli is here today to talk with us about what resiliency looks like in grief. So really excited that they are willing to come on and talk with Henry and I today about that. Henry, how are you doing?
I am good. How are you?
Good. Doing well. Definitely in a place right now that talking about grief is going to be helpful, I think. So excited in a weird way. Excited it definitely isn't the word to talk about grief. Probably need to think about a different way of saying that, but definitely anticipating and looking forward to this conversation, because I think that we, as a society, don't know how to deal with grief, one, and tend to limit it to conversations solely about death, which is a specific, very real, kind of the ultimate expression of grief when we talk about it. But the last 2 years, especially as a culture, we've talked more about what it looks like to grieve things other than just the loss of a person in significant relationship with us. So I think it's going to be a valuable conversation for all of us. And Lesli, why don't you give us, I'm sure everybody at this point who's listening knows who Lesli is, but we may have some first-time listeners. Lesli, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself, how you identify, and a little bit about why we want to have this conversation with you specifically.
My name's Lesli Hudson Reynolds. I identify as gay and non-binary or transmasculine. Why you want to have this conversation with me? Because I'm such a wonderfully happy-go-lucky person. Maybe I don't know. No, I've been in the Side B community for about 12 years now. So this is, the loss of certain things that come with being Side B is certainly something that I'm familiar with. I've had a cancer journey. I've had my spouse pass away. So along with grieving, what it means to be Side B, I've also, I'm a widow and had some unfortunate events in the church. So I've had to grieve what the loss of Christian community looked like as a young person, and grieve what it felt like to feel like God hated me as a young person, frankly. So there's quite a few things, different aspects of grief that I think that I'm eager, I think would be the word, not excited, but eager to talk about today.
Right. That it's hard to look at a situation, because this is a little how I felt when we were planning the season of, like Leslie's our own personal Job. So let's just pull up their story and share all the different ways that Lesli has experienced a walk with grief. But on the flip side of that, it is one way that those of us who have experienced loss and have worked through grief, that we can make sure that those experiences are not wasted, for lack of a better term, that there is a lot of wisdom and a lot of understanding and compassion that you would have specifically surrounding subjects of loss, simply because you have had to walk through so many different hardships, that they each have a different form of grief that goes with them.
And I think that it's important that I know this is kind of a catchphrase right now, but that we normalize what it is to be grieving, that
Yeah.
it's not some big, huge thing that you have to, go in a corner and in a sackcloth, joking about Job and everything, that it's part of our everyday life. It's,
Right.
our parents, when we come out, our parents have to grieve their expectations for
Mhm.
our lives. I mean, there's just so many different aspects of what grief means and what we need to embrace with grief to really be able to, I think, embrace God and our relationship with the Spirit and what God grieves, separation from us. And I think that
Right.
that understanding grief is really understanding, having a better understanding of God.
Oh,
Mm.
that's a
I
great
love
way of
that.
saying that.
Sometimes I think another reason why our culture is maybe hesitant to experience the full range of emotions with grief is because we're taught or conditioned or maybe just falsely believe that, okay, well, we should be happy for the life we have, we shouldn't be complaining or whatever, or experiencing these emotions. And God is not afraid of our emotions. God created us as emotional beings with
Yeah.
the emotions. So obviously emotions are good, right? It just depends how we order them. Just like sexuality is good. It just depends how we order it. And so that's kind of what I always think about grief whenever I'm tempted to try to dig myself out of the pit or something. It's like, no, I can sit. I'm like, I can't sit here forever, but I can sit in my grief, certainly while I experience it, and invite others, not only that, but invite others along on the journey as well.
Well, the thing is, if you don't sit in it, it's going to follow you,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
it will make its way out. But we look at the Bible, and Jesus wept, even knowing
Mhm.
that was a temporary situation. Jesus wept. Jesus grieved, even if that was temporary. Yeah, I think that this happy-go-lucky is the way to be a Christian thing is just is toxic, and it separates us from the true nature of Christ and God.
Absolutely. It's a really sneaky version of prosperity gospel.
Mm-hmm.
That's exactly what I was
That
thinking.
if I don't act like this is bothering me, it'll go away. Or if
Yeah.
I act like this is tripping me up, I'm somehow denying the goodness of God. Or I know for me, a lot of times it's comparing to other people that, having lived in a pastor's family, we were exposed to every trauma and every loss of
Yes.
every member of the church. And so comparison has always been a problem with me, that anytime something I wanted to grieve a loss, my immediate response used to be, but this is nothing compared to so and so.
Compared to.
And
Mm-hmm.
so I shouldn't be allowed to grieve this because it's not as bad as what qualifies as being grieved.
Yeah.
And I think that's a lie a lot of us buy into, that
Yeah.
there's some level of what the trauma must be before you're allowed to experience grief.
That's
And that's not scriptural.
No, it's not. That's why a couple of years ago, I don't know where I got this phrase from, but I was like, it's not the trauma Olympics. It's like, and I think I've said that on here
Right.
before, but it's like we're all allowed to experience this without having to compare it to other people's grief or trauma.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's like, we were talking about, Leslie said something about like some formal process of sitting in sackcloth and ashes, but our society, especially in America, well, white America, um, white
Hmm.
Protestant evangelical America, will really narrow it down. This group that I grew up in, we don't have a lot of ritual anymore surrounding
Yeah.
grief. And that's, someone mentioned on Twitter a couple of weeks ago that we would possibly interact with one another much differently if everyone who has lost someone due to COVID or is experiencing some sort of grief simply wore a black armband as a reminder of, I am a person in grieving, which is
Hmm.
how society used to do things. I mean, if you lost someone, you wore all black for a certain amount of time. And there was time that society required you to go through the motions of grief and mourning. And we just don't do that anymore.
I mean,
But how different things might be as a society and how much compassion we may have for one another if we simply had a way of showing externally, this is what I'm going through right now.
yeah.
Um,
Becca, what you said just struck me as so poignant because I remember in 2016 my little brother died. And so I got the call Sunday. He died early Sunday morning, so I got the call. And probably my third call was my boss. I remember calling my boss, which is absurd if you think about it now. But I called my boss up and, hey, I'm not going to be at work tomorrow, blah, blah, this kind of happened. My boss and I used to go to church together, so he fits in that very small group where you said Protestant, evangelicals, whatever, whiteness. But so, like, I missed work that Monday and Tuesday because, like, I went to a different town, not where I live. And then I came back to work that Wednesday to like work for the day, and then I was going to be gone Thursday and Friday. So my boss takes me to lunch that Wednesday, and I'm like, oh, maybe he's going to like offer encouragement, something. He decides to do my employee review that day, and then he asks, or he says, you've been out of work for a couple of days, like when so-and-so's brother died, they like took a day off, but they were back. And I was like, looked at him, and I was like, are you serious? He's like, I just don't know why you need to be gone all week. And I said, if I need to be gone all year and I come back and I don't have this job, we'll deal with that then, but F this. I was like, we're not having this conversation. And that was the day I stopped taking corporate America seriously, as a side note. But like, the fact that like he could not understand why I needed a week to like, we hadn't even had the funeral. I was just like, why would, like, there's no timeline. Like, why did he want to have a 2-day timeline? And he's like,
Yeah.
he said to me, you didn't look like you really want to be at the office right now. Like, read the room. Of course I don't want to be here.
And that's very culturally American. You know, if we have
Yeah.
people from other countries listening, it's, you know, grieving periods. You know, 3 days is what's typical for an immediate family member.
That's
You know,
wild.
in most HR policies, and that's asinine. It's absolutely
Yeah.
asinine.
And I worked in HR. And I was just like, oh gosh.
Right.
Yeah, that's after that, anytime people started asking for like time off or bereavement, I'll just give them like 5 days, 10 days. I wouldn't even care. I was like, you can tell them I approved it. So,
Right.
but yeah.
Yeah. And looking at relationships, especially that for those of us who are side B, often it's not the death of a person that we're having to grieve. It could be the loss of relationships. It could be grieving an assumed or a dreamed future. I know Leslie mentioned about parents having to grieve. What what has helped most for the two of you for grieving loss of relationships that may not necessarily be through death, but just grieving relationships in general? How are some ways that you've faced that in life?
I found an amazing group of friends where I live. That there's like 6 of us, and we almost have a covenant friendship kind of thing. It's like we do vacations together. We're there for each other. So like if there's something that, for instance, last night, the island in my kitchen completely fell apart. Like generations of crystal lost. But it's something that physically I can't pick up and take outside. So I, put it out to this group of friends, and it's being taken care of today. Like actually while I'm recording this, there's somebody at my house fixing it.
Aw.
And so creating this community, and it takes so much more effort, and it's a constant effort. And I think that there's still that fear of, okay, well, this person can move away, or this person can, whatever. And there's always that, okay, well, what if the other shoe drops kind of thing. So there's still a grieving of the assuredness of
Mhm.
a spouse, and I know
I
that
love that.
people will come back and will say, oh, well, but people get divorced. Yeah, they do, but you don't walk into it assuming you're going to get divorced.
Right.
And it's, like for me, when I went to this thing that I jokingly called the granny group right after Sue died, because it was me and a bunch of 70-year-old women, and they were grieving like the loss of the partner that they'd had their whole life. I was grieving the promise of what I was supposed to have with Sue. So it really wasn't an incredibly helpful group because we were grieving 2 very different things.
Yeah.
And so I've had to learn to articulate what I'm feeling, which has meant being incredibly introspective, and being able to share that with people and finding people who are willing to sit down and listen to that. And I love the way Kat LaPrairie puts it, that she wants someone to just sit in a puddle with her. And so, but you have to explain what that puddle is for people who don't understand. And so, just being able to express exactly what I need. And it takes a whole lot more work than just rolling over to the person, that's next to you in bed, that's walking through life with you.
Yeah. Bekah, how would you say about that?
Yeah, that having that group of people that are going to not necessarily even understand, but are willing to be in it with you has been something especially important as I've grieved relationships. More so, like Leslie said about this dream or the potential of relationships, that like when you realize that something you are anticipating is not going to come to fruition is a lot to have to walk through. When I ended an engagement, it was a similar kind of thing of there are all this anticipation of this is how things are going to be. This is the potential that we're looking at. And then when that relationship ended, there was a delayed, because again, I didn't think that I deserved to be able to grieve that. It was like, well, that's just life. That's what happens. And it took a little while for me to say, no, this is something I need to be able to work through. But having friends who understood that in those first few months, it was just kind of packing up, putting it in a box and moving on with life, but that they were willing 6 months, a year and a half later, that as things came up and it was a new wave, a new cycle of grieving, that they were willing to be there for that, that it wasn't, it's been long enough, you should be over this, which is something that you can hear a lot. But having those people who are faithful to be there for the long term, that grief doesn't end after you've been through 1 year of marking all of your firsts for something. In fact, usually the first year is the easiest. It's after all of that it's like, oh, I still have to keep doing this. That it can be hard. And so having people that are just aware of that and allow you to continue to process are really the most valuable to have around you.
Yeah,
And
I'd agree with. Sorry.
Oh no, I was just saying, you look at the 5 stages of grief, and people expect this to be like some linear journey that you're going on. Like you said, it is cyclical. Like I felt like a ping pong ball, bouncing back and forth between the different stages of grief. Like it's not like you get done with bargaining and you move on to anger. Like it just doesn't work that way. Like, anger comes back frequently.
All right. Oh, anger is the one that comes back for sure.
Yes.
At least in my experience, I've noted that. Yeah, I think what both of y'all are touching on about finding the right people to really walk with you through it. Because Bekah, you said it's not like they can even fix it or do anything about it or even fully understand it, but just their willingness to be there and step into that. Like Leslie, you said, sit in the puddle with you. And I think because most people, sometimes we have this like idealized version of grief, like it's going to be this trajectory like you were just talking about, then I'm going to come through it and I'm going to be this. But like find people who actually want to sit in the mess with you. That's not as common as people think it is, especially amongst believers, which is actually shameful because believers should be the ones that know how to experience grief the best. But oftentimes, like we touched on earlier, we want to just rush past it, put on this face, or think we shouldn't experience it. And what I've noticed in my life is the group of people that I've had to, in various seasons or stages of my life, been around me as I've experienced grief. And I think that's one thing, since we touched about it, like relationships. I remember I had a friendship that was ending from 2018, 2020. It was just a painful, And, I actually started in 2017 because I remember that one. Wow. Yeah, and I get mad now just thinking about it. But, it's like grieving something while you're still in it. Like, the loss is coming. And so it's like, and then you're helpless to stop it and you're trying to do all these things. But it's like, I have to learn how to grieve this. That, like, similarly, I went through something recently And when I came out of my coma, a friendship of mine that was very close just ended. And I was talking to my therapist about it. And I didn't feel any sadness or anything like that. And I was like, why? And he's like, Henry, well, you've been grieving the loss of this relationship for 2 years while you've been in it. So you're just now relieved probably to be done with like the aspect of it. But like, don't discount the fact that you've been grieving it for 2 years. And I sat there and I went through some of my notes and I was like, oh yeah, I had been grieving this thing like while I was going through it. And I didn't even realize that too. So.
Yeah. And it's, something that you said is like, people don't have to do anything to sit with us in that puddle. It's, I hear so many times, I don't know what to say to them. I don't know what to do. When someone is grieving, just sitting there, just being with them, like you don't have to be, the joker to make them laugh. You don't have to fix somebody's problems. Just being there so that the person isn't alone, speaks volumes and can do so much, can do so much good. It's,
yeah.
I'm thinking about I'm sorry, go ahead.
I know, I was just going to say, when you said that, it made me think of my best friend John, who we've talked about on here before. But we lived together before he got married, then like he was going to get married and whatnot, so I was just grieving the loss of like our friendship that was going to change. For sure, we're still very close friends, but like the dynamic looked differently and whatnot. Yeah. And I remember we were laying in the living room. He was laying on one couch, I was laying on the other. And I was just kind of crying silently. And then he's like, what's wrong? And I kind of just explained to him some of my fears and whatnot. And he didn't try to solve it. He was like, Henry, I don't know like what's going to happen, but all I can promise you is that I'll be there for it when it happens. And he has not broke that promise. And I was like, okay.
See, that's a beautiful way of saying it. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And that's a unique thing, I think, for those of us that are side B, is that we find these incredible friendships, and then these people, a person gets married and you find someone that you consider your best friend standing up on the altar talking about their best friend that's not you.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
That can be incredibly painful. And once again, grieving, the expectation of what that friendship was going to be versus where you rightfully so were going to now fall beyond the covenant that they've made before God with their spouse.
Yeah, that's true.
That's very
one
true.
thing we talked about Job a little bit earlier, but that's something that's always struck me about that story, is that like his friends,
terrible friends.
They're getting it right though, right up until the point that they start talking. Like if they had just continued to sit there with him in silence in the ash heap, they would have been fine. They were doing exactly what he needed them to do until they started trying to fix it. And that has been a good reminder for me over the years, when I've tried to be there for people who are grieving, because that can be so awkward for those of us who want to fix things, of I don't know what to do. But just remembering that sometimes we just need to sit with people, and that's okay, and that is doing something, and that is fixing something, because if nothing else, you're fixing the aloneness, that they're not having to face that by themselves. Lesli, what are some things that were helpful and maybe some things that were not so helpful for you, as you have grieved the loss of Sue?
Well, helpful, obviously, people who just showed up, people who continued to check in. It's anyone who's been through a death cycle with someone that's intimate to them. That like the first week everybody's there, the first month people have kind of dwindled, the first 6 months people have really dwindled, and after 6 months it's you're sitting in an apartment alone by yourself. And like for me, I was in a town, we had moved to a town right before Sue passed. I'd been on tour, and so I didn't know anybody in the town, and had just joined a church and was just getting to know people there. Wow. And so like Wednesday night and Sunday were the only times I would have any human interaction. And so, I think this is something that for any single person, not just a side B person or for a widow, is to understand that single people need the church reaching out, to include us in family, to include us in just in everyday life. It's, I've said that I can do that out of the three kinds of intimacy that I've found, which is physical, emotional, and spiritual. I can do without one of the three. Yeah. So I can do it, but if you take two away, I can't survive. So
yeah.
If people are, when people show up emotionally and spiritually for me, I'm okay not having the physical. And so once again, it's taken a lot more work than it should have. I hope that people listening to this, can start being more proactive so that, maybe the next generation coming up after us and stuff aren't going to have to work quite so hard at finding it. But little things, like inviting me to a family dinner, meant the world to me at the time, because I was just coming back to the church, and I was still under the mentality that people thought that LGBT people were evil and they wanted to keep them away from their kids and stuff. So when I was invited into somebody's home to be around their kids, that just meant the world to me back then. And it's, there are certain what I call tender days. So like her birthday, the day of the fire, the day of her death. The people in my circle know what those dates are. Mm-hmm. It's funny. Sometimes they'll sneak up on me, and like last April, I was just acting all wonky, and one of my friends was like, "Leslie, do you realize that Sue's birthday is coming up next week?" And I was like, "That's what's happening." Like it's because subconsciously these things happen, and so just they've invested in me, and it's I feel so lucky, blessed, whatever phrase you want to use, but people who have become that intimate circle for me. Once again, I know I keep going back to that, but that's what's really made a difference for me being able to pursue.
That is so beautiful that you had people who were willing to be there through that long haul of just developing the time to be able to do that. To have real, true intimacy, it can't be immediate. And so the fact that they have been there for you long term it's really a beautiful thing.
It's actually on one person's Google Calendar, Sue's death date, so that every year they know exactly when to be there and support me. It's been incredible.
See, that sort of intentionality is a blessing.
Yeah, that's a gift. Yeah, that's a gift.
Yeah, love being able to see how people support one another that way. Relationships through loss, through breakups, divorce, death, those sorts of grieving processes can in some ways look really similar because you're grieving the loss of intimacy, the change of a relationship. There are many things as side B Christians, especially, that we have to walk through a grief process with. Some of it is grieving the future, like what we thought our lives would look like. A real concern that people have to deal with, especially those of us who are looking at future without the prospect or the conviction of having a spouse, is grieving the loss of a sexual relationship, of that sort of physical sexual intimacy. What does the process look like for grieving celibacy? How does that look for those of us who know that is something that is not just a hope for, but that we really need to deal with in our lives?
I will say that probably my process is not the most healthy. So let me start out by saying that. But I cannot look long term. My love language is touch. So I'm really just kind of screwed in this process, unfortunately. But so like I have to I've turned it into a positive thing. I have to every day lay it at God's feet. So it's my anchor to God every morning. Today, I'm not going to do this. I can look a month down the line. I can look a year down the line. Beyond that, it becomes overwhelming for me. Yeah. And I think part of that is we need to recognize that there's a very different journey than that those of us who have been in a physical relationship are going through, because we're grieving the loss of what we know. We know what that is. We know what it means to physically connect with somebody, physically and emotionally. We know what that beautiful moment can be. So that's what we're grieving. Yeah. People who have been celibate from the get-go are grieving the loss of what they don't know. and the potential of all that. So I want to recognize that there are two different journeys there that are happening. But for me, it's like I said, I mean, it has to be a day-to-day thing. It can be a week-to-week thing. I so admire people. I've been on panels with people who said, yes, I've committed lifelong celibacy. I've been at this for 12 years. I don't think I'm going to falter on it. But I can't look past this week. But I really see it as a positive now that it's an anchor chain that I have to go to God with this. And I've made it something that I'm kind of, like I said, that I'm thankful for, because it's something that I know if I don't go to it, I'm going to mess up. I will. Yeah. So I have to constantly go back to God, so I can only pout for so long, or, be a brat for so long when I'm upset about something in my spiritual walk. I have to go back to God and say, okay, I need to lay this at your feet before I do something stupid.
Yeah. And that is such an incredibly healthy and self-aware thing to know. I mean, I used to sit in that overwhelmed despair, thinking that I had to get myself to a point of accepting this is going to be my life. And especially in my mid-20s, when I had just left a relationship and was making this commitment to this conviction of this is how God wants me to live my life. Of that being overwhelming, especially when I looked around and most of my friends were getting married. Some of them had already started having kids, and it was #forever alone before hashtags were cool. And so that I have that same sort of thing of, I cannot look at this as a lifetime commitment. And for some people, they're like, oh, what a lack of faith, that no, it's not a lack of faith. I fully believe that God will sustain me for the rest of my life if this is how I am to live. That is not the problem. I trust God fully. I don't trust myself. Yeah. And being able to say, thus far the Lord has brought me, that loss of relationship and grieving that relationship is an Ebenezer sort of thing in my life, that from this point the Lord has brought me. I believe he will continue to bring me. But I can trust him with right now. And I know that right now I have the mercy and the grace to sustain and to continue living. And that is my plan, and that is my intention. And that sort of sustained walk, you're right about it being an anchor. That's something that I've written about before, that why I don't pray for God to please make me straight, or even God please bring me a husband, or I don't pray those things, not because I think that he can't necessarily do them, but my thought has been the last few years of, it would almost be cruel for him to, because this is the thing that I know I have to come to him for daily. Mm-hmm. And why would he take away the thing that I need, that most helps me realize my dependence on him?
I don't know, Becca. I think if we had to live with a man, that might be something we would have to go to God.
Okay, girl, I'm telling you, liking men is ghetto. Liking men is ghetto. You'd be grieving that, okay? Grieving that too.
I mean, I spent the first 21 years of my life sharing a bathroom with my brothers, and now I share a bathroom with my 7-year-old son. I mean, and that's enough testosterone in my house. So yeah, I feel you.
Yeah.
I don't even have boy pets, so.
Oh my God. Becca, something you said, and two things you said really stood out to me. First, when you said the Ebenezer remembrance tone, sometimes I always think even now when I'm going through something, and I'm like, oh my gosh, how am I going to get through this, Lord? How are you going to carry me through this? And then I remember, I'm like, oh my gosh, there's been times where I was sitting on my bedroom floor crying, couldn't get up, but the Lord got me through that. So he is going to sustain me. And even if in that moment, I know I don't feel like he's enough or anything, I just draw upon the memories of the times where I've doubted that before and he's shown up. And that's what helps me through my grief process sometimes, because nothing else can. I'm like, God, I ain't got nothing but you. And right. I think that's such a great place of despair to be. And the Lord, I think, in his kindness, even uses those moments to really shape us and teach us that, I have been enough for you before, and I'll be enough for you again. And what else did you just say about whenever like you don't even pray for God to change this or do that because not because you can't, but like it's almost not even helpful because then it creates this false sense of hope that I think especially that other Christians love to latch onto for us.
Yes.
And maybe that way you could convince yourself to do something or push yourself to do something versus why if you just sit in the grief and deal with the reality of the situation, that's honestly more helpful and as a better propellant towards Christ because you're dealing with what's in front of you.
Exactly.
Yeah.
I don't want to place my hope in anything but Jesus. And I know that for me personally, that is what happens when I look with anticipation or with possibility of that sort of relationship that I have needed to grieve that of saying that is probably not going to be a part of my life. And I am okay with that because it is what God has brought me to. And I know that He's going to sustain me through that. And so grief over a loss of a sexual relationship with someone has been an act of trust and an act of worship because it's me saying every day, I know that you will sustain me. I know that your love is better than life, that I have experienced this thing and I can still say your love is better. That grieving is a step of obedience in my life. Because if I'm not grieving it, then I'm not really saying, I have handed this over to you. So it's a huge thing that I think if we don't allow people to recognize that, especially for those of us who have been in physical sexual relationships with people, I'll never forget one of my counselors once told me just because something was wrong doesn't mean that it wasn't real. And that
Ooh, come
that
on,
was,
therapist.
yes, right. That was a huge game changer for me of
I'm writing that. I'm taking notes on from both of y'all. Like as
absolutely.
we're
I
sitting
mean,
here, I just been taking notes.
that yeah, that was such a game changer for me of recognizing that my feelings, my emotions, that relationship was real. And whether I was convicted to end it or not had nothing to do with the realness of the experience. And so I still needed to grieve that in order to be able to be useful to God or to anyone else.
Yeah, and
Um,
I'm sorry.
Go ahead.
No, I was to say that's one thing I've been so incredibly grateful for, both my community in Massachusetts and now down here in Tennessee where I'm living. No one has ever asked me to call Sue anything other than my wife. Like there has never been, an expectation that I would like regret my relationship or wish that I hadn't been in that relationship. They've all been incredibly respectful of the fact that this was my wife. This was someone that I had chosen to do life with.
Yeah.
And frankly, I don't know that I would be where I am right now if Sue were still alive. I get asked that question a lot, and I don't know the answer to that.
Yeah.
But that's helped so much in grieving the loss of her that I've been able to healthily hold on to her as well.
Yeah, that's incredible. I know that there are many of us that probably have not had that experience with churches and with friends in grieving past
Yeah, I love
relationships.
that.
So that is a beautiful example of what that should look like.
I was gonna say I'm old, and so when I was testing churches down here, especially, I walked in and I was just incredibly blunt. Because
Love that.
I don't have the capacity to grieve a whole lot more in my life. I'll be honest. You jokingly said Joe, but it has been, I feel like little pieces have been broken off, with all these different things that I've grieved. And I don't feel like I have a whole heck of a lot more that I can lose. So when I walked in to each church, I was very frank. I had one-on-one meetings with pastors and stuff to see if I would be safe. And so before I set foot in this church, I had already met with the pastor and one of their group leaders and knew that this was going to be a safe space for me to come in and pursue a relationship with Christ and to grow in my relationship. I'd had 2 years of incredible failures prior to that, so it's not like it's something that was easily obtained. I'm incredibly blessed, but it's unfortunately was a whole lot more work than it should have been.
What are some ways that that facing grief through the various experiences that you've had have helped you combat issues related to shame? Is there any way that you see a connection of that grieving has helped you combat shame in any way?
It has, yeah. When you know, I grew up in the '80s in the Southern Baptist Church in Houston, Texas.
Bless you.
So yeah,
Yep.
we were in the height of the AIDS crisis. So it was the gay plague. We all should die. That kind of stuff. And so I felt like, because that's what was coming from the pulpit, I equated what that pastor was saying to what God felt about me. And so, of course, internalized a lot of shame with that. And now being in a much more healthy place, both in my church in Massachusetts and here, I've been able to grieve the process of what that pastor was teaching, honestly, and to almost pity that pastor that he doesn't understand God the way that I understand God. But it's taken me grieving the loss of that childhood innocence, the loss of what should have been taught to anyone, forget an LGBT person, but just any person, about what God believes about them, to combat the shame that I felt as being an LGBT person. And I've said this before, I don't know that that's fully going to go away this side of heaven. I think that's something, because it was ingrained so young, is going to be here, and it's something that I'm going to have to continually grieve. It's affected my current church relationships. I will always feel like an outsider in the church, and I think most LGBT people can relate to that. Even in the most accepting of places, you always feel like there's some kind of a barrier between you and everybody else, just because this particular sin has been taught to be so different. Or not that being LGBT is a sin, let me clarify that, but that this particular thing is so other, that it's just like, I feel like there's kind of a line drawn, whether it's there or not, it's drawn in my mind now. And it's certainly something that I'm in the process of grieving. I wish that I could say that I was on the other side of it, but I'm not.
Yeah. Well, and you talk about that it is not itself a sin, but how many of us grew up in church that it was either implicitly or explicitly taught that being gay was a sin? So we know better, but also that is what was ingrained in us growing up for a large number. So yeah, there's a lot of dealing with that shame that goes with that. But it does help in those ways of building and developing resiliency, that you go to a gym to lift weights, and it's the weight that helps build strength, that when we face adversity, that is what helps us develop that resilience, so that the next time we are able to get back up and to do whatever, and to see how God is going to be there for us. What are some ways that your experiences with grief, that you can look back and see that they were ways that God has helped you build resilience and trust in Him?
Oh, wow, so many. Just talking about, what you were saying about, bouncing back and everything. I think the biggest thing that I have learned is what God intended for me and what I deserve.
Oh, wow.
It's like, I almost feel shame even saying that I deserve things. Because it is so, like you said, it was so ingrained in us from a young age, implicitly or explicitly. So it's been a journey with God to understand what I deserve in relationships, what I deserve,
Yeah.
what I should expect from the world. And so I think that anytime we have a trial of any kind, whether, grief or whatever it may be, we get to know God on a level that we wouldn't have known otherwise. Those of us that have had the church walk away from us when we came out, we understand what Jesus felt like when the disciples all turned their back on him. We get an insight into Christ in a way that, that other people don't. And so, I feel like there's an insight to God that I have that other people who haven't experienced the things that I have just simply don't understand. You can only depend on something as much as you've seen it played out in your life, I think.
Mm-hmm.
You can say, yes, I know it will be there, but to say, no, it has been there is very different. And so, you know, I know my boundaries a whole lot more because of it. I think I'm a much healthier person, even though I'm healthier than I was. You know, and it's, you know, Henry jokes about, you know, writing this stuff down, but it's thousands of dollars in therapy that has gotten us these catchphrases.
Okay.
I'm at a couple thousand myself. Yeah.
Right.
You know, I don't know. I think it's, I think the biggest resiliency is just knowing who to go to, and it's no longer a journey for me when I'm grieving of how do I get to God. It's wow, this is happening. God, let's go. I can't do this alone.
Oh, yeah.
So there's just a much more direct route, just because I've faced it in so many different things.
Wow, that's beautiful. Henry, what about you? How has grief helped you with resilience?
I think grief has shown me, one, that I am resilient, or that I have the capability to, through Christ, to withstand a lot more than I thought I could on my own.
Yeah.
So, and it's also, I think, grief has just shown me that, like, it's all going to be a part of life, and that the resiliency comes from accepting that we can't escape it, because especially in how I grew up with just an abusive home and stuff like that. My therapist told me maybe this was last year, that he's like, sometimes you have patterns too, where you're going to try to do everything you can to mitigate or avoid grief or make anything less, when it's like, sometimes just out of my control. And like, there's nothing I can really do here or there to shift the amount of grief I'm going to experience over the course of something. So I might as well just not like lean into it, but almost embrace it as a sort of like, okay, this is going to happen. I know where my foundation is, and I'm going to be okay, even in moments when I'm absolutely not okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's a wisdom to the acceptance that you have to go through it versus trying to spend all the energy getting around something that you absolutely can't get around.
Yeah.
Just buckling down and getting through it with Christ.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's a beautiful way of saying it, that especially in the American culture, like, we don't like to talk about death. We don't like to talk about loss. It's one of those icky kind of experiences that we would prefer to avoid. But there's a lot of health and a lot of resiliency building when we just acknowledge that loss is a part of life. And when we face it, we need to do so with the full understanding that God is there with us to have those relationships surrounding us now, so that when we deal with grief, those people are going to be there, and that we are one of those people for others. You know, that developing those relationships ahead of time is what really can be our saving grace in those moments of having to deal with grief and loss. You can't wait until then to try to find your circle of people. It's too late. So being able to have those things in place, simply because I think it's something that is not necessarily unique to Side B, but is more pronounced. I think that we have a definite loss. We have a more pronounced difference in how we live life, that we know these are some things that are going to be different for me compared to other people. And so having that awareness requires us to have more intentionality, I think, in preparing for when those things are going to happen in life. Like, we don't have the luxury of thinking nothing bad is ever going to happen to us. And I have friends that are in blessed and I think privileged places that they've not experienced a lot of loss of any kind in their life. But that's just not very many of us in this community in particular.
I'm sorry, go ahead.
And I was going to say, Bekah, what you said about make sure where are those people for other people just made me think of the passage in 2 Corinthians, 2 Corinthians 1, 3-5. Praise be to the God and Father of our Lord Jesus Christ, the Father of compassion, and the God of all comfort, who comforts us in all our troubles, so that we can comfort those in any trouble with the comfort we ourselves have received from God. For just as we share abundantly in the sufferings of Christ, so also our comfort abounds through Christ. It's just a passage. I remember someone shared that with me probably, I think I was a senior in high school, so in 2007. And it's just always stuck with me whenever I'm going through something and then I experience like the love of Christ and just the comfort through that. It's like, okay, Henry, God's going to use this later, or just remember this later so you can be this for someone else in the same way you just experienced it.
Yeah, Leslie, was there something that you were
Oh
thinking
yeah,
before that?
just about the intentionality of it. You know, it's
Yeah.
I'm an only child, not super close to any of my cousins or anything. You know, when my mom passes away, and essentially I will have, like, I have an aunt and uncle, but I'm not super close to either of them.
Yeah.
So without that intentionality, like, I really would be completely alone in this world. But with intentionality, like, I think that I have a stronger network than I would have had I had brothers and sisters or, you know, or something else.
Yeah.
And these are people who have consciously committed to being there for me versus like are stuck there because of blood kind of thing.
Right.
You know, they're choosing to be there and walk with me. Yeah, but it does. It takes intentionality to find that.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, this has been a great conversation. I appreciate you willing to do this, Leslie. We have been closing our episodes this season with a question that I like. This is depending on the day, I think I answer it differently. But Leslie, what would you say to your younger self? And you can pick which younger self you'd like to address, but what would you say to your younger self?
I think if I could say anything to myself at any point in time, it would be myself as a teenager. And I would just say he's wrong. Talking about the pastor that was teaching me that I was an abomination and that God hated me and there was nothing I could do to get to God. I would just want to say he's wrong. God is chasing you. God, it's not that you have to get to God. God is running after you.
Oh my gosh, Leslie, I could just sit under your advice and wisdom all day. I mean, like, truly, like, there's so much that, like, there's just a blessing when you speak, and honestly, it's like you're a teacher. And so thank you so much for just sharing that gift with us. Thank you.
Yeah,
Thanks for having me.
appreciate it. Yeah, I never cease to be blessed and encouraged with a conversation with you. So thank you for sharing your wisdom out of grief and how to do that well, and for sharing just a little bit of your life with us. We appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.
All right.